Okay. You sure you're ready this time?
It's not me. There's nothing up here, buddy.
Oh.
Hello, my name is Rain Lawyer. I'm 12 years old from Ottawa, Ontario. I'm the owner and creator of Rainband's cosmetic alert bracelets. I'm currently running my Keychains for Cheeto campaign, where I raise money for the Cheetos Gender Clinic. And if you'd like to know how you'd be able to help me with this fundraiser, please visit my website, www.rainbands.ca. That's www.raynbands.ca. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Disability Inclusion Podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode.
Thank you for joining us today on the Disability Inclusion Podcast. We are joined by the Critic for Labor Relations Act member. No, how do you... It confuses me how this is. Your Critic, Labor Relations Act member, and Standing Committee on Regulations and Private Bills, right? You're not Critic Labor Relations. It's Critic Space.
Yeah, I'm the it's weird. I'm the Critic Labor Relations Act. There's actually four labor critics because of how many attacks there's been on the conservative government. So originally I was a labor critic, and then we had split that down so that I have Labor Relations Act. Guy Bourgoin, MPP Guy Bourgoin has trades, labor, trades. MPP Wayne Gates has WSIB and safety as the labor file, and then MPP Peggy Sattler would have Labor Employment Standards Act. And it's really just because the file is so large and that every single bill, or just about every single bill, has some sort of clawback or change to labor, and it's a way to divide the work. We sometimes overlap and help each other. We work sort of as a team on it. But that is how they divided the critic portfolio.
So that shows right off the bat that the NDP actually care, because instead of being put on one person and being... I don't even understand how you could possibly go through every bill possible to see how it affects labor relations. Like you said, like everything affects... Well, technically everything affects everyone for the most part, but that...
Yeah.
Does that I know this isn't something you could probably tell, but when the NDP form majority government in Ontario next election, would that translate? Would that be the ministers of labor relations, or...
I don't know how it would translate over, so there's some flexibility with the government. It would probably end up as probably a minister of labor, and then you would have parliamentary assistant for the files underneath it. What happens for the governments right now with the Conservative government, for example, is that you have a Minister of Labor, but there's a whole machine, a nonpartisan machine, in order to help work on stuff. So there's the partisan sort of conservative side of it, but there's a lot of work behind the scenes. There's a whole building, halfway down the street from Queen's Park, for the Minister of Labor, with employees and deputy ministers all working there. And so on the critic side, you have the critic, who is also a full-time MPP for the riding, who generally, like every other MPP, has 2 or 3 staff helping them, right? So you have staff who help you at Queen's Park, you have staff who help you in your riding. So you're trying to reply to your constituents in your riding, so just the people who your riding boundaries reflect. And you're also trying to work on your critic portfolio. And so if you have, as a critic, just the critic for labor, and they have to cover employment standards, WSIB, safety, and labor laws, it's very easy to be drawn into one area or another area and not give enough focus. For example, WSIB is horribly broken, and there's a ton of work to be done in WSIB. What you see a lot of with WSIB for people who have become injured for a long period of time is that they go from working in a job, collecting a decent wage, depending where they work, but to becoming injured, to ending up on either OW or ODSP. And this is a trend that happens all the time. And we already know from the stats, there's a very high number of people who are automatically denied and have to fight for years, sometimes for decades, to get compensation. And so there's a whole area of WSIB to be fixed. When it comes to health and safety, and Wayne has both these files, but when it comes to health and safety, you have similar issues where, across Canada, about 1,000 workers are killed in the workplace every year. About a quarter of those are in Ontario every year, and those stats haven't changed dramatically, at least in the last 10 years. There's a little bit of fluctuation, but there is no real drive that I see to reduce the number of workers who are killed at the workplace in Ontario. We've had Westray in place, which is a federal law that would hold employers responsible if there was, if there was just any death, but if there was a lack of, my mind just went blank for a second. If there was a lack of, there's a requirement under the Act to take every precaution reasonable, and so if you were negligence in the death, no different than if someone was drinking and driving and caused the death, you'd be held criminally responsible. Same with employment standards, right? So all these employment standards, we'd have the ability to bring in paid sick days, but if you have one critic trying to balance WSIB safety and advocate for paid sick days, or my second oldest son was born the year that the 1 year maternity leave was brought into, so he was a January baby, and I remember my wife having false labor in December and realizing that within a couple of days she'll go from 6 months of mat leave to 1 year of mat leave. And so advocating for why these changes are important and staying on top of them would be really difficult for one person to do with this tiny, support team of, 2-3 people, maybe 4 people helping in their offices.
May I ask, because you said that WSIB, and then you mentioned Ontario Works and ODSP, you referred to it as a broken system. Is it broken, or is it working the way it is set up and the system needs to be replaced, not repaired? Because being advocates for the disabled community, ODSP is a big part, and the system, all 3 systems you mentioned, the onus
Borderline
is
corrupt.
well, they're abusive. They put people who, when you're talking OD or WSIB, this is someone who has just gone through a traumatic event. This is someone who is adjusting to many things, and yet it is all on them to be every part of their fight. Some people can, I'm talking the average person, not a unionized person. Yeah. So it's a nightmare. And is that not how the system's designed? Like, are we pissing in the wind when we're trying to fix systems that aren't actually broken? They're set up to be like that.
Yeah, well, they've drifted, and what I mean by broken is it's drifted from the intent, right? So the idea of WSIB, or workers' compensation, as it was originally called, was the Great Compromise, right? So it was the divide from it would protect workplaces from their employees suing due to negligent injury. Or injury in the workplace, and it was supposed to be this sort of fair compensation where because you're unable to work because you're injured in the workplace, that you would have money at the end of the day. Now it's been transformed over years, and you can blame liberals and conservatives for the changes over the years, but no one goes back to patch it, right? All they do is blame the previous government. So liberals will blame the Mike Harris government, and then Ford will make some changes and he'll blame McGuinty and Wynne. And so what's happened over the years is, instead of it being a system to take care of people who've been injured at work, it's become a system to reward employers for good behavior. So it doesn't matter that the system is set up, like you said, in a broken way, so that the government is handing out rebates to workplaces. And in fact, in the past, the government was handing out rebates to workplaces that had fatalities the year before, because they had a fatality, but a year later they had a decent track record for safety, so now you get a rebate. And so the intent of it, of taking care of workers who basically have lost their way to earn an income due to workplace injury, has moved away and has become almost I think the reflection of changing it from compensation to insurance. How often has insurance ever said, hey, let me get the tab for that, right? So if you get into a fender bender in your car, a lot of people don't even want to deal with insurance because it's such a fight. And like you said, it is especially if you don't have representation through a union, or if you can't afford representation somewhere else, it's complex, it's broken. I forget the exact stat. I'm in my head, I'm thinking about it's 65-70% of applications are rejected on its first application. You have to appeal to it. And it really is set up in a system where, you know, people just don't have the wherewithal. You're trying to recover. You're confused. You're brought up basically to believe that there's a system in place, and if you're hurt, you know, everything will work out for you. You know, there's a lot of people, if you talk to them, they think that the reason that it doesn't work out for some people is because those people aren't really hurt, or those people have cheated somehow. Because the mythology is there that WSIB works for everybody, and that if you're injured at work, WSIB takes care of you, and the reality doesn't reflect that. And as well in it, there's a lot of signs that WSIB is also broken internally, because they're allowed to audit themselves, and they're allowed to internally, you know, determine how effective they're being, right? So if you're not having a third-party auditor, you're not listening to people who are auditing from the third party, there's a lot of ways for you to overlook ways that you should be improving, because it would reflect poorly on that organization.
I worked in a auto parts factory, and the repetitiveness of the motions, something funky went on with my knee, and I had to take some time off while my doctor was trying to figure it out. And that's when I learned of failure to disclose pre-existing conditions. And they said because I played hockey, it must have been a hockey injury and not related to work. And unfortunately, I didn't know at the time. I was pretty young, working in a non-union factory, so I had no idea. I just moved on and suffered the loss of a job. So it's definitely not a system designed to protect and help workers. Really, it does more damage than it does good overall in my eyes.
Yeah.
With your role as critic, you can't go and change things, but as it stands right now, when you see people who lash out at you or get angry at you about certain conditions, how do you process that, and what would you like people to know who are angry about things and see you as a politician and don't realize you are opposition? You are not the minister who can go in and force change.
Yeah, it's I think part of it is just recognizing where people are coming from. So there are people who sometimes will say to me, you know, when are you headed back to Ottawa? And I'll tell them, well, I'm going to Toronto, and they'll apologize. And I'm honest with them. If I wasn't, you know, involved with politics on a regular basis, I'd make the same mistake. I'd have a hard time telling the difference between an MPP and an MP. And, you know, we get phone calls that are for the municipal, you know, people talking to us about snow plowing or potholes on their road, or, well, passports, which is more federal. And the reality is that people are so busy that it's difficult to keep track of all this. They understand there's a government, there's politicians out there, but all the details, like any workplace, right? So, you know, if I pass by a bread factory, I know they make bread, but I don't exactly understand how the system works, right? I have a general idea. And so I keep that in mind when I'm talking to people. So it's a little bit of an education conversation. So like you had mentioned, I'll have questions for me sometimes. Let's say with COVID-19, you know, why aren't the vaccines here in Sudbury yet? Well, I don't know, because I don't control the vaccination plan. And you know, the Conservative government, the Doug Ford government right now, generally hasn't shared any information with us. You know, in the lockdown, we knew as much as anybody else. I was watching the press release with everybody else. And so on December 21st, for example, he announced there'd be additional support for businesses coming in January. And there was no information sent to any of the members' offices to be able to share that with small businesses. And then in January, I mean, it just went live last Friday. So, you know, 2 weeks of January went by with no information, and then suddenly it goes live. And so it ends up being really difficult for somebody who says, well, you're part of government, because they just see Queen's Park as government. But the reality is, the way government is set up, is that you have a government side. They can either be a majority, like Doug Ford has in Ontario, or they can be a minority government, like Justin Trudeau currently has federally. And you have critics sides or opposition sides. And so the idea, and there's this really great analogy in Queen's Park when you're in the chamber, the sort of main place that you see on the news, across from the government is an owl carving on the wall, and that's supposed to remind the government to make wise decisions. And then across from the opposition, the other side of the house, is an eagle, and that's a reminder for us to be very critical and look for ways for the bills and for these laws to be improved. And that's the idea of a democracy, is that, you know, the government is supposed to make wise decisions, and as opposition, we're supposed to offer ways those decisions can be improved. And then I think a good example of this is, you know, in the first year following the election, I'll screw up the order of the words, but it was a bill to provide natural gas to, and this is where the order gets messed up, northern rural Indigenous communities. So it might have been rural, northern, and Indigenous, or Indigenous, rural, and northern. But it was the idea that natural gas isn't really distributed fairly in northern communities. It isn't distributed very well in rural communities like farm communities. It isn't distributed really well in Indigenous communities. And so the bill it made a lot of sense. You know, there were some minor gripes with it, but the main part, and I think I said this 8 times during debate, on different days of debate, nowhere in the bill does it say that once we give this money to the natural gas developers, that they have to use the money to expand natural gas into a rural area, a northern area, or an Indigenous community. So, you know, if I'm expanding, you know, north of Barrie, as you see those rows of houses on farmland showing up again and again. So if I can put in 1,000 houses for the same price that I can put in like a neighborhood of 20 in a northern community, if I'm profit driven, like a gas company would be, I'm going to put that money into expanding, you know, north of Barrie or other places where you get a bigger bang for the buck. And so, you know, in those 8 times that I spoke during the debate, that was ignored every single time. When we brought that forward, you know, during amendments, it was ignored. And so it's as frustrating for me as a politician, because I know what people are asking for in my community, but I also recognize that they think that we have more power than we do when we're in opposition, that we can, you know, I've had people who are, for example, being evicted from their phone, who want me to pick up the phone and call the premier and say, you know, you have to stop, you know, Karen is being evicted. And that's just not really how the system works.
Is the bill to expand internet into rural areas worded the same way?
So the thing with it, I just saw again the announcement to expand internet into the north. Now, unfortunately in Sudbury, because most areas of Sudbury, we have decent high-speed internet. Right now, because of the lockdown conditions, you get a bit of a lag because everyone's on at the same time. And there's a couple of areas, just because of the way they're wired, the high speed isn't able to keep up as technology advances. But my riding is mainly a city, so I'm fortunate that way. But surrounding Sudbury are lots of areas where there is no access to high speed at all. And as you go farther north and northeast, there are areas where there's no internet. I was driving to Thunder Bay. God, it feels like COVID has been around for 3 years, but about 2 years ago, I was driving to Thunder Bay, and there's a whole area where there's not even cell service. You know, it's not densely populated, but that's the reality for a lot of places. So this morning, I saw that the government is investing money again into internet in the north, and maybe they are, but I'll tell you, the last time they made that announcement, about 1.5 years ago, a year later, they hadn't spent a nickel on expanding internet into the north. So I'm always optimistic and hopeful that they'll be doing the right thing. But if all you're doing is announcing that you're doing something, I'm not interested. I put your money where your mouth is, put shovels in the ground, make things happen for sure. You know, one of the things I've been advocating since the beginning of the election is 4-laning of Highway 69 to Sudbury. And this is something that has been going on for close to a decade, and we're almost done. There's 68 kilometers that hasn't been tendered yet. And I've been clear with the transportation minister and the premier. You guys get it done. I'll get you a bulldozer. The premier could sit on it. I'll take the photo. I don't care. But the reality is that Northern Ontario needs a 4-lane road going to the first major city, which happens to be Sudbury, but it's an important progress. The next step is actually improving the Highway 17 that goes from Sudbury through Sault Ste. Marie up to Thunder Bay and out to Western Ontario. A lot of people don't realize this, but that highway is our only artery to the rest of Canada if you're moving goods and services, right? So we have train routes, but if you're moving things by ground, that highway in a weather storm, if there's a car accident, I was traveling back on that previous trip I was talking about, there was a transport on its side, and that highway was closed down in both directions. And that's the reality for so many people in that area. And in the year 2021, we can't have a system where if there's a car accident, you shut off the main artery that connects our province with Western Canada.
I spent a good portion of my life in Huntsville, and 69 has been under construction, and that whole gateway to the north has been a thing since I was a kid. So the conversation started so long ago. With you had said about the money going to people or to organizations or companies and that, and it doesn't actually have to be spent on the thing that the money was given for, or the reason the money was given. And we talk about the $12 billion the Ford government got from the federal government, and there's no strings attached. This is for this is why we're giving you the money, but then it doesn't have to get spent on that. How does that exist in all these different levels and all these different things? Like it's Ontarians' money, it's Canada's money. How is,
Especially with all these lawyers that are MPs and MPPs. Why is it not written properly?
well, it would be on purpose, I'm assuming, but how is there no I don't even,
Accountability.
it's not even accountability. Why doesn't it get spent on the money or on the thing it was intended for?
Yeah, it is very frustrating because if you were to apply, your organization were to apply for a Trillium grant, for example, it's very specific. You're getting this amount of money, let's say, $50,000, $100,000, so that you can renovate and so you can add, additional. You can replace your air conditioning and heating system. You can repair the wall that is falling apart. It's very prescriptive of what you're allowed to do. When it comes to these transfer payments to the province, the idea is that federally they make a decision that each province is going to get a certain percentage of some money in order to help them with aid, because it's a cost above and beyond. It's almost what we're seeing municipally as cities are struggling to make ends meet. And asking for money from the province to help them. And so the idea is that, the federal government can't get so far into the weeds to say that, you're going to use this much money for infrastructure and this much money for buying PPE and this much money. And so they give you, as a province, a bag of money. Unfortunately, what we're seeing out of this is Ford is sitting on it, right? And so I'm not shy to say I'd like the Premier to get off his wallet. The stats following the summer, the first shutdown of COVID-19, was that 97% of all money that was spent in Ontario came from the federal government. So that means that Doug Ford and the Conservatives spent about 3% of that money. You have small businesses and nonprofits who are dying every single day. When I walk to Queen's Park, when I'm in Toronto and I head to Queen's Park, I see another business with a closed sign on it. And that's reflective across the country. I'm seeing this right across the province. I've seen this in Sudbury. I'm seeing people who are feeling frustrated with the lockdown orders, that especially the most recent ones where, big box stores are allowed to stay open and sell anything they want, not just, prescriptions and food and the essentials. They can sell whatever they want, but the store down the street can only do curbside for that stuff. And you basically have the Premier setting up almost a monopoly for these big box stores who really are doing well, right? They're making record profits. And you look at a place like Loblaws. We're into the second wave of COVID-19. We're into the third or fourth week of a lockdown that just keeps being extended. Loblaws is making record profits and has been since the beginning. They've always been a profitable company, but COVID-19 has been very good for Loblaws. They're making record profits. They've stripped their workers of the pandemic pay that they implemented, even though we're in a second wave, which is a lot of experts are saying is much worse than the first wave, and that seems to be okay. Just recently, the Minister of Labor talked about all the inspections that they did. They did all these inspections at these big box stores, and they listed, I think there were 61 of them with violations, but they wouldn't say which 61 were or what the violations were. And so how does that translate into safety for people who are shopping there or for the workers who are there? It is a very broken system, and it's frustrating to watch, as opposition, to hear these sort of press releases that are broken. And ultimately, going back to what you're originally saying, is that the $12 billion, this didn't come from Deco labels. This wasn't like Doug Ford dug into his couch cushions and pulled up $12 billion. Yeah. It was, the majority of that was transferred over from the federal government with the intent to help people get through COVID-19. And so, you want to stop the spread of COVID-19, people need paid sick days. They need paid sick days. So if they think that they're sick, or if they're waiting for results of a test, or they're being sent home because there's COVID-19 in their workplace, and their workplace is telling everyone to self-isolate for 14 days. If you don't have paid sick days, you just can't, right? That was a reality growing up with my mom. My mom, I mentioned earlier that below the poverty line. And so my mom, if she was sick but could get out of bed, went to work. And so did her colleagues. And they spread the illness back and forth. Unfortunately, back then it was just a common cold. But we're dealing with a virus that's highly transmittable. And we need to be very honest that we can't get through this. We can't save lives if the premier is choosing to save money over lives.
Well, exactly. And I worked before I became too ill to work. I was working in a call center, and they would say, well, if you're sick, go home or not come in. But at the same token, if you missed more than 2 consecutive days, then you needed to have a medical form filled out by your doctor. So it would then cost you $50 to have a form filled out if you stayed home from work if you were sick. So then, of course, people came to work, and then you're in like this room with hundreds of people that are all talking, and you're in a petri dish.
Yeah.
So if you're in
those doctors' notes, they've been debunked so many times. Like, doctors don't want to do them. There's no data to show that it prevents people who are abusing the system. People who are abusing the system just work that into the calculation, right? So I'm gonna take a day off. I'm gonna tell my employer that I was sick. Along the way, I'll stop at a walk-in clinic and I'll have a form signed out. And the reality is, the form doesn't diagnose that yes, you were sick on this day. All it says is basically, this person says they're sick, they're okay today and okay to return to work.
Yeah.
And so it gums up the system. It causes longer wait times. You create a system for the majority of people who really are sick. You create a situation where a sick person goes to a walk-in clinic where other people are sick. They're more likely to share whatever virus they have with the other people in the room. Some of those people are vulnerable. A lot of those people are seniors who are going for tests. They're not recovering, because really what you need when you're sick is sleep. Like you take, you rest and your body fights off whatever sort of illness you have. And so someone at HR at some level decided this was a way to deter people from taking days off, but it doesn't prevent you from getting sick in the first place. It increases the likelihood of other people getting sick, and it costs everyone a lot more money. This, the hallway medicine, all the problems with our healthcare, one of those problems with the backlog in healthcare has to do with people going to doctors, going to walk-in clinics, going to emergency clinics who don't have to be there.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that you said there, I've been trying to figure out for Ontario Works, ODSP, WSIB, all these programs that are supposed to be supports. We had talked earlier about the onus is on the person, but for example, on these programs, it's a doctor who, the person filing the request for help is a go-between between a doctor and a place of work or a program, a government program. So why does the abuse and the mental health impact of these situations get put on the person? Why isn't the government dealing directly with a doctor Why is it for me, I'll specifically use my situation. My doctor helped me fill out forms for ODSP and CPP and all these programs because I could not. But then I am the one who has to answer all these questions, be told this is not good enough. We need this and this and that. When the system's set up like that, it's very clear they're trying to. All these systems are dismissal based and rejection based, hoping people just go away.
Mm-hmm.
So when all these systems are built like this, like the sick notes, and there are people who just should not go to work, period, not because of COVID. COVID's just amplifying things that existed before. So just a normal cold spread in the exact same way. It just was not as newsworthy. So how do we come out of this? It really seems like the status quo is being pushed and being pushed, and it's like, let's hope COVID goes away without changing anything.
But
So
COVID is just going to put a bigger strain on it because people are coming out of COVID with chronic conditions.
so how do we change what how do we take the lessons learned and actually get governments to change these programs other than supporting the NDP to get in? How how do we change this?
Well, the reality is that, and it's going to sound partisan because I'm going to say you need to vote for an NDP government because we're working class people. You know, I had a conversation with an MPP, and I don't want to say which one, but a conservative MPP, and I was talking about how life for a lot of people is really difficult. And their response to me was that they knew exactly what I meant because their friends had Acuras and they only had a Toyota. And I'm not, it's funny to say, but I'm not making fun of that person. That's why I don't share the name.
Uh-huh.
But that was their perspective on life, right? They lived in a neighborhood where, you know, as teenagers or in their 20s, your parents would buy you like an Acura. And so she was embarrassed to have a Toyota, but felt like it was a lesson from her family about struggling and making ends meet. Well, the reality for a lot of workers today, there are a lot of workers out there who can't afford a car at all, used or new. Their parents aren't in a position to buy one for them. And so when you're looking at, if you're looking at people who are on WSIB, or you're looking at people who are on OW or ODSP, and your perspective is that you don't know anybody who's been through that experience, and you've never had to go through it yourself. And so your point of view or your framework for that is, well, that system works. I know it works because all of my friends who've never dealt with it say it works. And if you back up to, God, all the way back to say when, you know, Reagan and Mulrooney and Thatcher, whose conservative and Republican ideology came through, and they really opened up on this war on the poor, right? They talked about welfare queens. They really said, you know, they brought in trickle-down economics, which has been debunked for nearly 40 years. And they really pushed this agenda that, you know, the reason things aren't working well is because this guy's getting a free ride and you're paying for it. Well, you know, all these companies, these large corporations, these wealthy families who aren't paying their fair share, don't look at them. Don't look at anybody in the Panama Papers, you know, all those Panama Papers that released of all these companies and people who are hiding their taxes and their wealth overseas. You know, we don't have to chase them. Look at the federal government. The focus right now is to chase people who got CRB who shouldn't got it. But the people who are hiding, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars, some cases millions of dollars, revealed in the Panama Papers, well, that's not that important. You got to look at this little guy who's taking advantage of the system. And the reality is most people aren't taking care of the system. Any system you had, it's a very small percentage who are going to abuse it. But for the longest time, people in society have been convinced and improperly educated that the people who are on OW or WSIB or ODSP, you know, they're faking, or they don't want to work, or they don't, you know, it works well and will take care of you. And for the people who it doesn't work well, it's something with that person. The reality doesn't reflect that, and so we know it on this podcast and this discussion we're having. But there are a lot of people out there who don't know it, and that becomes sort of a frustrating situation because, like you had mentioned, the system is designed to fail. The system is designed that if you don't have the tenacity and wherewithal to keep fighting, or if you can't figure out the forms that are super complex, or if you're not willing to go back to your doctor and ask them to say something differently, or in WSIB, if you're not willing to fight against the doctor who gives you this sort of phantom job and deems that you can get a job, doing a job that doesn't even exist where you live, well, it's very difficult. And the idea, the whole system is built on ignoring people and not reflecting basically, average citizens in the community, and just paying favors to your wealthy friends. I really, before I got more involved in politics, when I thought my involvement ended at showing up to vote in every election, I honestly didn't think like politicians cared, because what I saw again and again was laws that were designed for the most wealthy people. So if they happened to help me, that was fine, but I never saw that as the intention of a liberal government, a conservative government. I didn't think they were looking out for the little guy. I just thought they were just doing whatever they happened, and it happened to help out somebody who was a little guy. It was coincidental, and it wasn't until I got more involved having conversations with New Democrats, becoming a New Democrat, actually seeing what our platform is, and looking out for things. I mean, look at our hydro system. Kathleen Wynne sold off Hydro One, and the only reason the Conservatives bark about it is because it was Mike Harris and Ernie Eves' plan before that, and they didn't get to pull the trigger on it. But they sold off Highway 407. The amount of money that leaves our province for Highway 407, that it's not even Canadian owned anymore. So it's not even that a company in Canada is making money. It's split out over the world. The costs keep climbing and rising. It is a cash cow that we sold out for nothing, right? The Conservatives literally gave it away trying to buy an election by balancing the budget. So they gave it away to some of their friends. Long-term care is another good example of Mike Harris gets the blame for privatizing long-term care. There was some private long-term care before that, but he really kicked the doors open. This guy is a millionaire now because he's profiting off of the privatization of long-term care. He has something like $7 million worth of holdings in privatized long-term care. And now he's up for the Order of Canada.
Yeah, that takes
Order of Ontario, I apologize. It's unbelievable. And so that wasn't, when Mike Harris kicked the doors open, the Liberals didn't close them. They just said, oh my God, look what Mike Harris did. But they didn't change anything.
Yeah.
Right? And so there's that old story from Tommy Douglas about how mice keep voting for these two different cats, right? And they tried the black cat and the white cat and the spotted cat and the striped cat, and they can't figure out why the cats don't care about the mice. Well, the reality and the moral of the story is cats don't care about mice, right? So
they just want to eat them.
yeah. So unless you're wealthy and well connected, Liberals, Conservatives don't really care about you. You might benefit because of something they're doing to help one of their friends, but that's incidental to them actually going out and saying, you know what, OW to ODSP have been broken for a long time. Let's address this. Let's bring it up to today's standards. I had a constituent talk to me saying that the percentage, he was on OW, the percentage of OW that is for rent, he's not allowed to spend any other money for rent. And he said, this is ridiculous. Where am I going to find rent in Sudbury? I think his number was $347. What was it?
$475.
Or I thought it was $375. So $475. Where are you going to find rent for $475?
It used to be $450.
Like in Sudbury, you're lucky if you can share a place with 4 people and each pay $475. Mm-hmm. And I'm talking about a 1-bedroom apartment. Or a 2-bedroom apartment. It doesn't fit the reality. And earlier I talked about how the ministry has this whole building full of resources. It's not like they don't know, right? If I know because I have a newspaper or because I talk to 4 or 5 people, I'm sure that when you have an entire building full of people looking at an institution, it doesn't make sense. And I have no idea how in a place like Toronto, where the cost of living is so much higher, how anyone can make ends meet who is trying to get by an OW, ODSP, or WSIB payments. It just isn't reflective of a livable wage,
Well, let's be realistic. It's not like these people are horses. They don't really need help. And I want to, before we move on, search Mouseland from Tommy Douglas. If you're listening to this, stop watching this, pause this, and go educate yourself on Tommy Douglas's Mouseland speech.
We were discussing that before you came on. That's
Um,
why we both chuckled.
we want to take a pause. To Sarah wanted to ask you some more personal questions, and then I do have some other questions if we still have time about labor and stuff like that. So I wanna make sure we get these questions in before we continue on.
Yeah, it won't take long. I just noticed last week that you had tweeted about donating plasma, and I just wanted to uh, make sure that we discussed and talked about the importance of people still booking appointments and donating blood and blood products even during COVID. That the need is still there, um, and probably we should even mention about organ donation. Make sure that you've gone to the website or have it on your license um, for
Yeah,
that as well.
yeah. If I do those backwards, just because I might forget about the organ donation, I'm really fortunate as a new MPP. MPP Frangielina, who's our health critic, has the riding that circles mine. We sometimes joke that I'm the Timbit and she's the donut. Um, and she has been an MPP for a long time, and I think no matter who you ask, whatever party in the House you ask, um, they would give her a really high review. She's very well respected, and so I'm fortunate as an MPP to have her sort of as a mentor and someone I can ask questions to. But one of her private bills that she brought forward, it hasn't gone through yet, but is to make organ donation the default. And then what you would do is you'd fill out a form to say that I don't want to for personal reasons, religious reasons, whatever else. But the default would be that you are an organ donor, because the data shows us that most people are in favor of it and don't get around to signing their card.
That's
Uh,
awesome.
and that's something I believe one of the things I struggle with, especially with this conservative government, is the lack of data-driven decisions, right? Just decisions based on what the facts are. And so if the facts show us, for example, let's say the facts showed us for that one on organ donation, that the amount of people who want to donate fill out their cards right away and get them in, then it wouldn't make sense to pass a bill where the default is that you donate unless you opt out. But the data is showing the opposite. And the same thing that's, right now in the midst of COVID-19, they recently, conservatives recently announced some support for small businesses. But, from the summer until the second week of January, small businesses and nonprofits were saying, I can't pay my rent, I need money today. And time again, the Conservative Party kept saying, well, just you wait to the end of the year. Oh my God, there's gonna be so many tax rebates for you. Well, if my business goes under in August, I don't care what my tax rebates are at the end of the year. Like, I don't want to lose my business. And that's what we're hearing time and time again. And so the data we're getting for people doesn't reflect, the decisions the government is making. Going to donating plasma, I used to donate blood as a teenager. So my friends and I forget why we started. Well, someone probably had the idea. So we all went together and we went on a regular basis. And then somewhere along the line, I got out of the habit of it. It was probably when my kids were younger and you miss an appointment and it just the routine falls off. And so I would say 15 years later, maybe close to 20 years later. No, I would be too old. It was 20 years. So 10, 15 years later, we had a coworker who had cancer, and there was a blood drive in his name. And so I went back and I've been donating blood regularly since then. I recently switched to plasma. We didn't have a plasma donation center in Sudbury. They have renovated, and so now we have a plasma donation center, but we don't have a whole blood donation center anymore because the need for plasma is much higher. And so the decision was made locally to have a plasma donation center. And following the example that Minister Phillips made at Christmas time, there was a real anger, especially towards politicians, because you're not following the rules that are for everybody else, right? So Minister Phillips had gone to the Barbados over Christmas, where everybody else was supposed to be staying home and limiting contact with others. And there was this frustration, and other politicians came out, and other People in the vaccination team have been traveling, people at hospitals have been traveling, and so there's this whole sort of heightened microscope on people. And I was already scheduled for a plasma donation, and I phoned them the first time, and I'm going to reschedule for the following week, so I'm going to change it by about 5 days, just to ensure that I'm following the proper rules. I checked with public health to make sure it was still an essential service, because I didn't want to not follow the rules. And then I followed up with a donation, and I have another one, I think, on Wednesday next week. But I appreciate being a regular donor. And what I've learned out of this, one is I'm in a position of leadership where it's important to demonstrate by doing stuff. And so I think donating blood or donating plasma is a way to show leadership and demonstrate to people how important it is. The other part, on a personal level, it's incredibly rewarding because I meet people. I had no idea how important plasma was on a regular basis to people. In my head, it was the sort of thing, if you're watching Grey's Anatomy or ER back in the old days, they asked for plasma during surgery. And so I thought it was a temporary thing. But, I've met a little boy who has plasma on a regular basis. I've met people who are elderly who have regular plasma treatments. A friend of mine had to go to Ottawa for stem cell cancer surgery, who required an incredible amount of plasma to get through the surgery. And so, recognizing how important it is and being concerned that with these lockdown and stay-at-home orders that people wouldn't know that you were able to continue to give plasma, and how essential it is just for people to live healthy lives. I normally donate all the time, but I want to make sure that I continue to donate, and I'm visible donating because I want to encourage people to also donate.
There's a lady who's very dear to both Jay and I, who's battling cancer right now, who, because of the cancer, has to get regular blood donations. So that's why it's dear to us, the importance of people knowing it as well. I used to donate on a regular basis before I got sick, but now with my medication, I can't.
Right.
But I have put my donor card in, and if they can use them, they can have them. If they can't, well, then they'll get burnt up with me, I guess.
Yeah. And as an aside to this, I have found out that I'm apparently very good at bleeding. so when I go donate plasma, I'm a maximum donor. It almost looks like the container they hold it in almost looks like a Gatorade container, you'd have on the side of a sporting team, and so that is almost filled to the top. So I'm able to donate a lot, which is good, and I have decent veins, so I bleed fairly well. But anyone who hasn't gone, really, go. It's a very safe place. It's a very comfortable place. They talk to you about what to experience, what you're going through. It doesn't hurt. It's strange because it's a decent sized needle that they give you, right? That they so that the blood can come out. It doesn't hurt at all. It's very comfortable while you're there. The people are very friendly, and so I really encourage people, because it's so important. Like you were talking about your friends, donate plasma or blood. There's that expression. I think it's a tagline for the organization: is "It's in you to give." And I often joke around like I'm good at bleeding. My superpower is bleeding, and I think that's something we're all good at. And if you're able to give, you really should.
I wanna go into a couple of harder things or heavier things.
Sure.
And I fully understand if you do not want to answer this question, but I want to take the opportunity to ask it based on because when you talk about the working class, most people think it means you have a job, but the working class is the bottom rung of capitalism, which is
Right.
workers down. So everybody under the wealthy would be or what is it? People who own the labor are above the working class.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. There's a bunch of terms for that, but I basically, anyone who is worried about paying their rent or paying their mortgage. So if you don't have a family of houses across the country, or if you don't, you didn't spend 30 years or 40 years paying off a mortgage, I would say that you're in that working class.
and we can go as far as to edit this out if you want. And I hate to put you on the spot, but I need to take the opportunity.
Yep.
We talk a lot. We see on Twitter you're pretty active on Twitter. A lot of people talking about the Conservatives and Doug Ford have failed Ontario, but is that not excusing it? Is this not Conservatives succeeding? Like they are doing exactly the long-term care homes, funding support for horses over people, abandoning the working class, the exploitable people of Ontario, funneling business to big box stores and stuff like that. Like the conservatives are conservative; they don't hide it. The liberals lie about doing this, and that what I think the only thing that makes them liberal is they liberally lie about things. But
Right.
it is this not getting to a point where it's almost a conflict where conservatives are benefiting from COVID and there's a major distrust of people thinking, well, because we have a majority conservative government, they are going to continue to use it to their advantage, such as university funding to a university nobody wanted,
Mm-hmm.
to not giving protective equipment to anybody in this province, to protecting the people profiting off of long-term care and not the people in long-term care. Like all these scenarios are because it's a conservative government. Is there nothing we can do as people to put a hard stop to this? Because the it's one of those really messed up things about how the system is we've elected them, now we have to wait till next election, even though they may not be killing people, but they are choosing not to help people, and by choosing not to help people, you're letting them die. So what exists to prevent a conservative government from capitalizing off of COVID in the ways they clearly have been? Sorry,
Right.
that puts you in a really hard spot to answer that, and if you don't want to, I fully understand.
No, that's fine. You know, my dad, well, my stepdad, growing up, uh, my mom and dad got together when I was about 15 or 16 years old. I'm generally talking about my stepdad when I say my dad, but he had an expression that he would say long before I was, a politician. It was that politicians are like weather vanes, and once in a while you have to remind them which way the wind is blowing. And so it does feel like with this majority, and they have a very large majority, um, that they are unstoppable. But that's not the reality. And what they're counting on, and liberals did the same thing when they had a majority, um, they're counting on apathy. They're counting on people to go, what can you do, and shrug their shoulders. And the reality is, and I would point to the autism community for this, even though they're not getting what they should be getting. The autism community did a very good job of mobilizing, communicating the message, what was wrong, what was broken, and forcing the government to make changes. Like they forced the government to replace their minister. They forced the government to go back to the table, I think, for the fourth time. It's very frustrating. The government keeps kicking the football down the road, but they would love to scrap the autism program or to have it gutted and just keep moving on, and they can't because of this community of people who care about autism being so good and effective of outreaching. And so what they do is they communicate in their community and get allies in their community, and they're not subtle at all. They go to MPPs, doesn't matter opposition or government, and say, I need your help, and if you don't help me, I will do everything in my power to ensure you lose the next election. And that's what conservatives need to hear. So, if you're concerned, especially if you're in a conservative riding, if you're a small business and you're losing your shirt and you think it's unfair the way you're being treated, you need to connect with your MPP and tell them. Not you're frustrated. Frustrated is important, but you have to be clear with them. There's an election coming, and when it comes, I will work as hard as I can to ensure that you lose. That's what's important. That's that part about the weather vane turning the head, because the conservatives are following the playbook that is set by Doug Ford in that sort of inner circle. The other part of it is that it's important to recognize where they're falling short, where the conservatives are falling short. The reason that the Liberals had 15 years of power because Mike Harris and Ernie Eves, who just followed shortly after Mike Harris, but Mike Harris did so much damage in Ontario, we're still feeling the effects of the damage. And the Liberals didn't fix a lot of that stuff. They just let it go, and every election they would say, well, we couldn't fix everything, but we're still working on it. There's always tomorrow. But the reality is that 15 years of a Liberal government had more to do with Mike Harris than the Liberals actually doing good work. It was people afraid of bringing back a Mike Harris government. And they only had the opportunity to win another election because trust in Dalton McGuinty was so incredibly low that they had to switch party leaders and brought in Wynne. And Wynne was so hugely unpopular going into the 2018 election that they only had 7 members and lost party status. You have to imagine the Liberals within one term went from a majority government to losing so many seats that they're not even recognized anymore. I mean, we, colloquially know they're the Liberal Party, but officially at Queen's Park, they are the independent. They had lost party status because they lost so many votes. And so we have to remind each other and have these important conversations, because in the next election, you're hearing it already. People who are so frustrated and angry with Doug Ford saying, oh my God, why do we vote Conservatives? The Liberals weren't that bad. They were. They were terrible. That's why we voted them out. That's why they were voted out across the whole province. They had scandal after scandal. There was so much mistrust. People were so angry at them. They'd done so much damage. The things that we're dealing with Doug Ford, it's the same playbook. Doug Ford's not fixing the things that Liberals put in place. Hallway medicine, Doug Ford didn't cause that. He didn't fix it, but hallway medicine was an issue while the Liberals were here. They weren't funding hospitals properly, privatizing public services. Liberals did it, right? So it's not, the difference between Liberals and Conservatives is, would you like your cuts with a scalpel or would you like them with a chainsaw? But cuts are coming from both those parties. They're not investing in public services. If you look at long-term care, they didn't stop the privatization of long-term care. There were problems with long-term care. That was the top 3 things I heard at the door in the last election was Hydro One, long-term care, and hallway medicine. Didn't matter if the person was conservative, liberal, or New Democrat, or Green, or however they were voting. Those are the top 3 things I heard, and I think it was across the whole province, but especially in my riding. And so we need to have the conversations. For some reason, I'm giving my age, but the year that Bob Rae was elected, I wasn't old enough to vote. But for some reason, when I knock on doors, people will talk about Bob Rae and, oh no, Bob Rae. And so when you say, well, how come, I would always reply, like, how come people remember Bob Rae, but they don't remember Mike Harris? Oh my God, Mike Harris was, oh my God. So I'm not here to defend Bob Rae, but I'm telling you, Bob Rae was a very long time ago. In fact, the volunteer who was with me very often, when I was canvassing, would lean over and say, I wasn't born yet. That's how long ago it was. It's like blaming John A. Macdonald for something that happened today, right? And so for some reason, there's this narrative in Ontario that, or across Canada really, that you have to choose between these 2 systems that don't represent you. And you have to vote for the one that you think is going to be the least damaging for you. And the party that is banging the gong again and again, the party that keeps saying the things that you're saying, that's talking about, smaller classroom sizes, so you have better education, opportunity for people who are poor and working class, the people who are speaking your language, you're like, oh, they'd be good in opposition. I don't know if they'd be good in government, which is weird because the NDP is the party who is saying, let's do the stuff that you were saying should be done. Let's fix WSIB. Let's make OW and ODSP substantial. Let's talk about having a guaranteeing income. Let's fix health and safety so that we stop having workplace deaths, or we start reducing that number drastically. Let's educate people before they get to the workplace about how health and safety works. Let's implement that into a high school curriculum so that kids are having this education early on. Let's start having things that are privately owned made public. The Conservatives, when we talked about making long-term care publicly owned, lost their minds. They lost their minds because they know how much money there is, and they know that after this is a stepping stone as an MPP when you're a Conservative or Liberal. It is a stepping stone for you to get a job in an organization that you helped set up to be super profitable. And so, while on the one hand, what's happening right now is a success story for the core value of the Conservative Party, it's not a success story for people who consider themselves Conservatives. When you talk to people who are Conservative voters, they believe in fiscal responsibility, but they also believe in fairness. They don't believe in leaving people behind. They don't believe in small businesses not having support or small businesses being shut down and big box stores taking all the profits. None of that, right? And liberals as well. I often tell people, if you think you're liberal, you're probably a Democrat. You know, it's just that people are busy. They only hear the ads during election time, and then they forget in between about the scandals that happen and the corruption that happens with that party. But I think that you need to talk about what's going on, and you need to remind people what's going on, or else we end up in that, Mouseland saga of mice voting again and again for cats and being confused and wondering why cats aren't supporting them, why cats don't care about mice. That's just the reality. Fat cats don't care about mice.
I like to say that the conservatives will shoot you in the face, the liberals will stab you in the back, but neither of them hide the fact. And I gotta ask, because you hit on the thing that just infuriates most NDP supporters. Strategic voting has destroyed this province. It has destroyed people's involvement. It has tricked so many people, new Canadians, disenfranchised, um, anyone who isn't highly invested in politics. There's the strategic voting. I think it's the liberals who it's a liberal product. Strategic voting is, oh, you vote for the NDP, it's a vote for the conservatives and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
How how do we change that? It's
We need to
one of the,
organize.
yeah, it's one of the major things that I've been with my Be the NDP thing. It's about getting people involved. I say be the NDP, but I also say get involved in politics. So
Right.
just getting involved is what is needed. Whatever party people want to go support and change. But I see the two biggest hurdles are strategic voting, where the liberals and conservatives have played off of each other for decades. And it's almost like, hey, we're done setting our, like you said, we finished setting stuff up and screwing up things. Your turn.
Yeah.
So how do we change this? How do we make it so very clear? Because COVID, the first election out of COVID is the absolute opportune time for people to go, enough of this crap. But they see what's happening with the news and the coverage, but they don't know really why it keeps happening. So how do we combat that, and how do we organize? For us, we're trying to organize the disabled community. Um,
Right.
how do people organize to actually come out of COVID in a better place?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting when you're talking about the strategic voting. There was an article, and I think it was this week, might have been last week, in the Beaverton, which, it's a joke newspaper, and all their headlines are jokes. But, it said 100% of Liberal voters would vote NDP if they thought the NDP had a chance of winning. And there's something very insightful in that joke, right? That there are people who go, oh, I would love to vote for that party, but they won't win. And literally, well, they're exaggerating, but 100% of voters who are saying I can't vote NDP are shooting themselves in the foot and causing a disservice, especially to like their children. Now more than ever, it's not uncommon to have our younger generations where they're graduating with more and more education without any form of a career, any hope of a career coming out there, being told by both parties, conservatives and liberals, that you have to be flexible in the future, that you have to work in gigs and contracts, and that there's just no reality that you're going to have a pension at the end of the day. Why not? Why can't I work for an entire year and have enough money to retire on? Why can't I, even if you're drifting away from the old school defined benefit pensions, but why can't I make enough money to make ends meet? Why do I have to have 4 or 5 different jobs? Why do I have to be at the beck and call? Why is it every time that a company is unionized, they're allowed to dissolve or leave? Why are the labor laws put in place for these workplaces, that the gig economy, where if I want to unionize my workplace, I don't get to know who the workers are, but the employer gets to know who all the workers are and send information to them about why unions are so badly, you know? Um, and so we really need to look at at the root cause. The ABC, or anything but conservative voting, is absolutely a liberal machine. I knew that long before I had started voting for the NDP. or long before I started being involved with the NDP as a politician. If you watch that, there, it really is an astroturf system, right? And so the idea for astroturf is it's a organization pretending to be grassroots. And so what you'll see in elections, you'll see people saying, we need to get rid of the Conservative Party, and it looks grassroots and it looks local. And then when you see that the polls in your area show that the NDP are going to win, the conversations all change to we need to vote Liberal. First, it's we need to vote for whoever is most likely to beat the Conservatives. You can't have the Conservatives win. And then in one by one in the ridings, as it shows that NDP is leading, it switches over to we need to vote Liberal. Liberal's the way we need to vote. And that's when they show their true colors in that sort of astroturf pretend grassroots situation. And that happens in a lot of areas as well, where you have ridings that traditionally, like there are ridings that have never had, a Liberal NDP representative, for decades. And similarly, you have some that have never had a Conservative win the election for decades. So, I talked earlier about Frangiana's riding in Northern Ontario. They've gone more than 50 years as an NDP government or NDP representative in that riding. So the Conservatives are not going to win in that riding anytime soon. But there will be people saying, you need to vote Liberal or else the Conservatives will get in. You need to vote Liberal, and pretend that the NDP isn't one of those options. And it really is, it's strategic, but it's not strategic for you. It's strategic for the Liberals to be reelected. I always laugh a little bit when I'm in Toronto, whenever the government tables legislation around the TTC. And not because I don't think TTC is important, but it's as I learned more and more about this TTC expansion, that as we flip back and forth from when Mike Harris filled in the construction project with cement, and then the Liberals scrapped Mike Harris's plan and they started their plan, and now Ford is scrapping the Liberals' plan to start their TTC plan. All I see out of that has nothing to do with, they talk about, the mom with kids getting to work and daycare and needing TTC to get there on time and the crowded buses. They don't care about that. The reason they scrapped the project isn't for more effective or more efficient transportation through, public transit. It's because Liberal developers are getting the gravy, and it should be Conservatives. And then once the Liberals come in power, the Conservative developers are now getting the gravy, and it should be Liberal friends. And then Doug Ford's got to change that because now the most recent Liberals are getting the gravy instead of his developer friends. But, it's a bit of a joke to watch this whole thing and have people with a straight face say, oh yeah, this plan that's been in development for so many years, where you've done the environmental assessment and the planning and the development and the engineering, we're going to scrap that and go back to the beginning. It'll be much faster to do this way. It has nothing to do with efficiency or helping people get around town. It has to do with rewarding your wealthy friends. And it's a bit of a joke on it. And so we really do have to do a good job as people who are New Democrats, people who believe in the NDP, of educating people about the importance of the NDP winning the election. Imagine what that Ontario would look like. There was a long period during the election, just prior to the 2018 election, where the NDP was going to form government in Ontario. And the reason we didn't is because Kathleen Wynne and the Liberals campaigned against us. They had went on about for 2 weeks prior to the election, leaned heavily into an NDP government would be just as bad as Conservatives. You can't vote for the NDP. Yeah. And they handed Doug Ford a majority.
Yep.
It's because of the Liberal Party that Doug Ford's Conservatives have a majority government. And imagine what Ontario would look like under an NDP government compared to a Doug Ford government. And remind your friends that the reason you have a Doug Ford Conservative government is because the Liberals handed to them on a platform. And the reason they did that is because the Liberals knew that if the NDP was in power, they wouldn't have as good a chance to ever regain the election. That people wouldn't vote for a Liberal government following an NDP government because we're both seen as lefties. And so if there was ever going to be a change, the change would probably swing right. And they would rather run against a right government and run that ABC, we need to stop the Conservatives, we need to fix their damage, we're the only ones who can help you. And they didn't want to have to do that against the NDP government. And that party should never be forgiven for protecting themselves and putting themselves ahead of the people of Ontario.
We checked Jay's riding and my riding and several others across Ontario from the last election, and there was more vote enough votes not cast in each riding to have won the election.
Yeah.
And that's what we've been focusing on, is trying to reach those people, the disenfranchised, the disabled,
Yeah.
to get them. That's what the NDP thing is.
Yeah. And there are a lot of people who are frustrated and just don't vote. And there's a lot of reasons to it, right? If you believe the government is all government, and if you believe that the opposition party isn't holding to account or isn't being effective enough, you just give up and you throw in the towel. On top of that, with the amount of precarious the employed people are underemployed, or people just living in poverty, you just don't have the time to do this sort of thing, to get involved with politics, to go out and vote when you feel like it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter if you're switching liberal and conservative time and time again, and they just keep cutting and making life more difficult for you and making life more unfair. What's the point of going out to vote? And so you need to have those conversations about, voting for a party that actually reflects your values and the things that you want to do. I had a conversation at a university about a year and a half ago, and they were asking why politicians tend to listen to seniors over students. And I said, seniors vote, right? If you want to make change, and a couple of years ago, there's a huge student movement to vote. But if you want to make change, if you want politicians to pay attention, let them know you're voting. Because if all you're going to do is complain, but you're not going to vote, nobody cares. Or similarly, there's some organizations that will promote, spoil your ballot, or don't go in to vote, to teach the government a lesson. When they see the number of people not voting, they're going to make change. They're never going to make change.
Because the people who still vote are the ones who profit from voting, the ones who get that conservative contract or that liberal contract.
Yeah. If any politician, if someone says I'm not voting, that you're not worried because you're not losing a vote. You're not voting for another party. You're not voting for me. It cancels itself out. The most important thing you should do is make an educated vote. To really cast a vote for whoever reflects you the best. Don't vote out of fear because the wrong person will get elected, or you'll feel like you have wasted your vote because you gave it to another party where you want to ensure that you stop a certain individual. Vote for the party that represents you the best, and really we would start having decent conversations around voting for the NDP, why the NDP should be elected, instead of these which of these two parties have will damage us the least amount. We'd start having conversations about how we could all get forward together, how we could all be successful together.